Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hilary Molina. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations, and thank you so much for joining us for the very first virtual alumni conference. It's been a lot of fun to plan, and it's been great to see all of your faces. I miss seeing you at winter session. My goodness, I really miss seeing you. So thank you for making the time to be here with us this week. So there's a couple of things that I wanted to go over how this is going to work today and what functions you have. You'll notice that you have the option of reactions at the bottom of your screen. We would love to see your reactions as we're going through the session. In terms of chat, we're reserving that for any questions that you might have for Carole and for me to ask Carole. So feel free to go ahead and include that. I would also like to make sure that we note that our Board of Trustees Chair, Karen Bogart, is also an alum, and she's on the call. There are so many screens right now. I know that you're here, Karen. Thanks for joining us today. So get comfortable. We're gonna meet an alum here who has just an absolutely fascinating background. And how did we even start this session? As I was looking at designing the program here, Carole had sent me her book. She has a book coming out called Connect. We're going to talk about that pretty soon. And I read about it, and just for some reason there was just like this instant connection. Like, I feel like Carole needs to be here and talk not just about her book, but she has the Charlie Seashore experience. And anytime that we can talk about Charlie. See, I'm seeing some heads nod right here. It's like magic just happens, and it's that, that Fielding connection that makes the community just strong in so many ways. So even though he isn't here, we can just really feel the love and the connection through Charlie. And so we look forward to talking a little bit about that. So Carole, Dr. Robin, graduated in '98. And she has taught the legendary Interpersonal Dynamics, also affectionately known as MBAs, at Stanford Business School. And she's been doing this for about...
Also affectionately known as Touchy Feely by MBA.
Known as Touchy Feely. And she's done this for 2 decades. So I look forward to, hearing more about that. So she is, the sessions that she teaches, students and executive participants who've attended these workshops describe them as life-changing and transformative, and learning on how to build exceptional relationships. So that was what caught my ear. I'm like, what? I want to hear what you have to say about that. So she's going to talk a little bit about why this has been a very popular elective at the school, and why it's lessons about connection and building relationships by cultivating authenticity, vulnerability, and honesty while being willing to ask for help. So Carole's journey began at a Fielding winter session where she was fortunate enough to attend a tea group by the extraordinary and dearly departed faculty member Charlie Seashore. He introduced her to David Bradford, who became her mentor and colleague at Stanford, and who is the co-author of their upcoming book, Connect. So that is my introduction of Carole, and I feel like we should just get started off by hearing about how you ended up at Fielding.
Thanks. First of all, I just have to say I am so excited about being here and connecting with the Fielding community. Fielding will always hold a very special place in my heart, and my journey to Fielding was probably not unlike most of yours, which is it was very circuitous. I have had 6 different careers. I had 4 of them before I ever got to Fielding. I started out in sales and marketing and industrial automation. Back in the mid-'70s, I was the first woman to be hired into a non-clerical job at a very large Fortune 50 industrial automation company. And so I spent my first 10 years in sales and marketing. And then I decided that after flying 100,000 miles in a year and wanting to have a baby and be around for my baby, I needed to make a change. I'm not going to walk you through all the different careers, but the two pieces of the story that are germane to how did I end up at Fielding are, one, when my husband and I decided we wanted to get married and have a child, we also decided that we both wanted the experience of being a full-time caregiver at home. And we both wanted the experience of being a full-time wage earner, supporting our family. We were both at the same point in our careers, young executives on the rise in big companies. And most of our friends were all trying to do both. And we decided we actually wanted, instead of trying to do it in parallel, we wanted to do it in sequence. And partly because I'm just too neurotic and I couldn't do two things that I cared that much about at the same time. So at that point, we also decided that it probably made more sense for me to be the first person to stay home. And then for Andy to eventually take over. And the deal we made was that I would stay home until our youngest child was well established in elementary school. He would continue to climb, up the ladder. And then when it was time, we would make the switch and he would come home and take the kids, the rest of the way, so to speak, until they went away to college. And I would go back to work and support us. And that's what we did. Now, when we made the plan, I figured I'll go back to sales and marketing, industrial automation. I'd been good at it. I'd made a lot of money. I figured no problem. But as you all know, funny things happen when you stop long enough to look around and notice that there are options. And so what happened to me was that when I was home with my very young children, with an infant and a 2-year-old, after a little while, once they started going to nursery school a little bit and I had a little more time, I was not ready to go back to work, but I did want to do something. So that started what I would call my nonprofit era. So I ended up on some boards and I ended up in some community organizations. And one of those happened to have had a Fielding alum on the board, one of my fellow board members. And his name was Tim Stanton. And we were working on a board called Leadership Mid-Peninsula, which was, these were all started in chambers of commerce all over the country by Joe Jaworski. And I said, Tim, I don't know, when it's my turn to support the family, I don't know if I'm going to go back to industrial automation and sales and marketing. I sort of been there, bought that t-shirt, did that. I think I want to try something else, more like what we're doing here. And he said, well, Carole, this is actually called leadership development. It's related to organization development. It's a whole field. And I said, wow, really cool. I think I'd like to do that. So I said, but I don't even know where I'd start. I was halfway through a master's in chemistry when I realized I didn't want to be a chemist. And that was the sum total of education that I had, or higher education. So he said, well, I'm an alum of this really cool program. It's called Fielding. And he was the person that told me about Fielding. And I thought, well, yeah, if I want to go become an organization development consultant and in leadership and get into leadership development, I should probably know what I'm doing a little bit more than I know now. So I'm going to go back and get a master's in OD. Now, in those days at Fielding, there was only the PhD in either clinical psychology or human and organization systems. Those were the only two options. I didn't want a PhD, but you got a master's on the way to a PhD. So I applied for the PhD program and I thought, what are they going to do? Deny me take away my master's when I say I'm done? I'll settle for the master's. Well, then of course I got to Fielding, totally fell in love with being back in school, fell in love with Fielding, decided a master's was never going to be enough, and and decided to go for my PhD. Now, part of what happened at that point was that I got more and more intrigued with this whole arena of human development. I didn't set out, by the way, certainly didn't set out to be an academic or a scholar. In fact, Barbara Mink, who was the chair of my committee, on my very first committee meeting, I sat them down. Charlie Seashore was also on my committee. We'll come back to that. But I sat them both down and I said, so let's just be very clear here. I am not getting a PhD because I ever intend to teach. So don't make me do all those stupid things that academics care about, because I'm never going to teach. Now, you all know that I ended up at Stanford and I ended up teaching there for many years. And so the cute part of the story, and I'll come back later and fill in the details, is that for 20 years, I got a little note from Barbara Mink on my birthday every year, addressed to Carole Robin, Graduate School of Business, Stanford University, that always started with, let me be perfectly clear, I am never going to teach. And she was the first person who said, never say never, Carole. Or she was the first person I listened to. So that's a little bit about how I ended up at Fielding. And it was like, as I think it has been for most alums, absolutely life-changing. I had no idea the path it was going to put me on.
So then you go to Stanford. How did you get from saying that you're not going to teach and then you graduate, and then what was your path to the Graduate School of Business in particular?
Well, that's where Charlie comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So Charlie, as I mentioned, had been a member of my dissertation committee. And Charlie, who, as you all probably know, was a very prominent figure at NTL, at National Training Labs, had been a very good friend of David Bradford's dad and David Bradford. Leland Bradford was one of the founders of NTL. Anyway, I never even knew tea groups existed, except I ended up at a Charlie Seashore tea group during a winter session and discovered, oh my gosh, where has this been all my life? So that was momentous. And I got really intrigued by the whole pedagogy. Now, because I was never going to teach, when I graduated, it's not like I made a beeline to Stanford. What happened was I bought into a consulting firm as a partner, and I started traveling all over the world. My husband and I made the switch after I graduated. So we had, and that, by the way, delayed the switch because it took me a little longer when I came to him and said, actually, I'm going to get a PhD. It's going to be a few more years. But we did eventually make the switch. And by the way, he still had to vest. By then he was an executive VP in a very big company in the Valley. So there was a lot of pragmatic reasons for us to delay the switch. But when we made the switch, I hit the road as a consultant, as a partner and principal in a consulting firm. I was traveling all over the world. However, Charlie, God bless him, may he rest in peace, and he is always with me. Charlie said to me, Carole, they're teaching this really interesting course over there at Stanford. You live in Palo Alto. You should go meet David Bradford. I was like, Charlie, I was really clear that I don't ever want to teach. He's like, I know, but this is an unusual class. You should go meet him. And by the way, it's tea group based, and you love tea groups so much, and they're desperate for another person to teach the class, and you'd be so great at it. At the very least, you should go meet David. I was like, okay. So I went to meet David, and that was in 1998, which was the year that I graduated from Fielding. And David Bradford said, hey, I'd love to have you go through our training program for our facilitators, because Stanford trains their own facilitators for these tea group based class called Interpersonal Dynamics, AKA Touchy Feely. And at the time, they were teaching 4 sections of 36 students. Long story short, after I went through the training program, I didn't do anything with Stanford for 4 years, and I had my whole consulting era. But somebody called me, I don't remember who called me, and said, you really should go back to Stanford because they loved you as a facilitator, and now they actually are looking for a faculty member, not just facilitators. So I talked to my partners, and we all decided, I guess I could be off the road 1 quarter a year. I was traveling all over the world, but 1 quarter a year, I could be in Palo Alto. I could teach this class. It'd be probably good for the firm. for them to say, you know, that one of their partners is teaching at the business school at Stanford. And so I went over and they said, we'd love to have you. And I started teaching 1 quarter a year. Then that was in 2002, and we still had only 4 sections. And in 2005, the school came to me and asked me if I would consider a full-time appointment. By then, not only had the course really taken off, by the time I left, by the way, just to cut to the chase, by the time I left in 2017, we were teaching 12 sections of 36 students. So they asked me if I'd consider a full-time appointment, if I'd consider teaching every quarter, if I'd consider teaching more than just Touchy Feely. Long story short, I decided to take a leave from my consulting firm. I wanted to be home a little bit more. I had a kid who was having some health problems. Fortunately, she's fine now. And so I thought, yeah, sure, I'll take a leave from my firm and try this teaching thing. And then I completely fell in love with my students, and I fell in love with teaching. And I went to my partners and said, you know, thanks, but I think you're going to have to buy me out. And I ended up at Stanford for 17 years, teaching a number of different leadership related courses. I taught Touchy Feely, Interpersonal Dynamics. I taught high performance leadership. I taught leadership coaching. I ended up developing a program called the Arbuckle Leadership Fellows Program, which is a year-long program that MBAs, once they get into Stanford, have to apply for. So it's even more crazy, stupid elite. And then that was, I guess, my 5th career, maybe 4th or 5th career. And I left Stanford in 2017 and started my own nonprofit leadership development firm, which is called Leaders in Tech, which I'll be happy to talk about if you all want to know more about that too. Oh, and somewhere in there, David Bradford and I decided to write a book.
So knowing that you ended up teaching the most popular course, what do you think made that course so important? Why was it so popular? What is it that the students needed, especially in this program, to have this type of class taught and then have it just explode and blow up?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that when I first arrived, the course was starting to get more and more, subscribed to. And I do credit Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence as being seminal in having people wake up to the fact that maybe the, finance and accounting and marketing weren't the only things that were required in order to be successful in business. What happened in this class, because it was T group, well, first of all, to my knowledge, it remains the only T group based course at a major business school anywhere. And I suspect most of you, if you haven't been in T groups, at least know what they are. They're an unusual pedagogy. They are the purest form of experiential learning. And so part of what happened in this class was that students arrived not really knowing what it was that they were going to learn. It's a little bit like one of them would say to me, well, it's not the movie I thought I bought a ticket for, but I sure as hell am enjoying the movie. It's a whole lot better movie than I expected. So what happened was that they had an opportunity to learn how to learn. And this is going to resonate as a Fielding message too. They weren't empty vessels into which we were pouring knowledge. Here's how to be interpersonally effective. We were putting them in groups and giving them an opportunity to show up and hear from fellow group members what it was that they were doing that were either making them more compelling, less compelling, drawing people closer to them, distancing them from them, having people trust them more, trust them less. So it was incredibly eye-opening for them, not only in terms of the way they were learning, but what they were learning. And then I think what really tipped the scale and had it become legendary is that it had this profound effect on them, not just professionally, but personally. So for decades, those of us who taught the class have received emails years later saying this class, certainly we get this class, is the reason I got promoted. This class is the reason I finally am a CEO. But we also get, this class saved my marriage. This class helped me reconcile my relationship with my mom. And so it was the totality of the way in which the class impacted them that created this ethos and then a myth. And then by the time I left, I've been told by the time that I left, over 50% of the students who applied to the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University said the reason they wanted to come there for business school, instead of perhaps other highly well-known East-based business schools, was because of this class. And then subsequently, because of the programs that it spawned, like the Leadership Fellows program and other programs that were very experiential based. Because we had a dean who was a strategist who said, well, let's see, we've got this unique value proposition. We do this thing that nobody else does. Why aren't we driving a Mack truck through this as a strategy? So we started adding more and more opportunities for students to learn how to develop themselves as human beings and as leaders. And as I used to tell them, people do business with people. They don't do business with ideas or machines or products or strategies or money. And that was a message that really started to resonate with them. And of course, as more and more students went through it, then more and more alums told students, whatever you do, don't miss this class. And, the flywheel got started. Now, after a while, I became known as the queen of Touchy Feely. We can come back and talk about how that happened. But, and then a bunch of people thought I invented it. I did not invent it. I'm old, but I'm not that old. And I stand on the shoulders of some truly greats, including David Bradford. But what the difference, I think, was when I came in, was that since I had had multiple careers and I had been in business, there was a way in which I could connect the dots for these students and help them understand how what they were learning was actually going to serve them. Perhaps from very real firsthand experience. And I think that gave me credibility. They also, one of the big things that we advocate in the class is truth telling, i.e. You all have worked, to the extent that you all work in business, you've worked with managers who say, oh, this giving people feedback, that takes so much time. To which I always say, well, there's actually nothing more efficient than the truth. So you can not tell them and let them spin their wheels, or you can actually tell them. And boy, how many organizations have we seen get in major trouble because they don't establish a norm. They don't bake into their DNA that truth telling is like rule number one. So anyway, I'm kind of getting off on that, but that's a little bit about why the course turned into something that was so big. And I was lucky I was in the right place at the right time.
Well, now I want to know how you got the name, the Queen of Touchy Feely. You have to tell that story now.
Well, I mean, I really did sort of point to it already, which is that after a while, students experienced me as the essence of what we were teaching. They knew they were always going to get a straight answer from me. They knew that they knew that, I mean, whether they took my class or not, lots of students, because by the way, the class was taught by other faculty. I was not the only faculty teaching it. But I used to get students who were taking it from other faculty who would come to me and say, hey, I hear that you used to work, that you used to run a company, a $50 million company. Can you tell me a little bit about how you used any of this stuff? And so there was a way in which up until they had a chance to talk about how do you use this in the real world, it felt a little California woo-woo to them, particularly if they were former investment bankers from New York. But it wasn't until we had exchanges where they experienced what it was like to build a relationship based on authenticity and honesty and vulnerability. But by the way, appropriate authenticity, that's a whole other concept. It's not just about bleh, let me tell you everything and overwhelm you. So, I think, and then, I don't know if any of you teach, I don't know if any of you are, know what it's like to be around a bunch of late 20 MBAs, but once something like a name like Queen of Touchy Feely catches on, then it just becomes, a thing. Just like Touchy Feely became a thing.
So you've now written a book that contains the lessons of Touchy Feely.
Hang on, before we go on to the book, could we find out if any of you have any questions about what I've talked about so far? And I'm putting myself in the shoes of either a current student or even an alum who's thinking, hey, can you tell me more about how the heck you got there? I know you've told me some, but if there's specific things you want to know, or what was difficult, or any tips, or I just want to give folks a chance to see if there's something they'd like to know more about.
Yeah, can you, hi, this is Drew in Chicago.
Hi, Drew in Chicago.
Can you solve all my problems in 60 seconds on the air? No, just joking. I would love to hear, Carole Robin's 5-step method to building exceptional relationships.
So first of all, thank you for the question. Second of all, when David and I set out to write this book, we were very aware that we were not going to write 5 easy steps to better relationships.
4 easy steps?
Human beings are much too complicated for that. The work is much too nuanced. One size never fits all. So step number 1, come to terms with that. Step number 2, I used to say to my students, a lot of people teach about leadership by having you look at other leaders and ask and study what is it that made them either effective or not effective leaders. Why did people follow them? Perfectly reasonable way to learn about leadership, not my approach at all. The question I used to ask them to sit in is, why would anybody follow you? And by the way, the reason they might follow you is different than the reason they might follow me. And yet they might follow either of us. So there's something about the work that you need to do on yourself, which is part of sort of point number 2. Point number 2 is to understand that you really have 2 antennae. One antenna is what's going on for you internally. And another one is trying to pick up the signals on what might be going on for the other person. And learning to both constantly be checking in and picking up both those signals and seeing how they relate to each other. The other, I'm feeling very resistant to 5 easy steps or 4 points, or that's why I wrote a whole book on it. Maybe one other thing that I'll say is that, it sounds trite and cheesy, but Rome wasn't built in a day. You don't snap your finger and suddenly build an exceptional relationship. Most of you probably know about the 15% rule, and the fact that you have to take and the fact that you have to take risks. You don't get to an exceptional relationship without taking risks, but you can't go from 0 to 100. So you have to take small risks and see where the relationship is, and then take the next risk. I don't
I
know.
haven't
I don't know if
heard of
that's,
the 15% rule, I admit. I haven't heard of that rule.
oh, okay. So the 15% rule is really, so you've heard about the zone of comfort. That's how you always show up and what you always do. Think of 3 concentric circles. Zone of comfort. Way outside the zone of comfort is the zone of danger, something you can't imagine ever saying or doing. But in the middle is a zone that educational researchers have to have fancy name for it. They call it the zone of proximal development, because why wouldn't you call something simple like that's where you learn, the zone of learning? You don't learn something by staying in your comfort zone, and you don't learn something by being way outside it. So that's the zone of comfort. Now, when I used to teach my students this, they used to say, but Carole, the minute I'm outside my zone of comfort, I'm scared. What if I'm out there in my zone of danger? And so we came up with the 15% rule. Try stepping outside your comfort zone a little bit, 15%. You'll know, you'll be a little nervous. You won't be freaked out, but you'll know you're just a little outside your comfort zone. And if you spend a little time there, your zone of comfort will redraw. And then you can step 15% beyond that. If I don't know, you live in Chicago, so you maybe are not a skier, but if those of you who ski know that you don't start out skiing by being on the double black diamond slope, but you also don't ever become a better skier by staying on the bunny slope. So it's the same concept.
Hi, yeah, thank you for describing that. I'm a current fielding doctoral student as well, and that reminds me of the idea of mindset from
Yes.
also. And I had a question about were there areas that when you kind of first were initially thinking about the teaching role and stepping into academia, that you were asked to demonstrate your teaching experience or research and transitioning from your role for your professional role into your teaching experience overall?
Is your question whether or not I was asked to prove my competence as a teacher before they gave me a chance?
For example, like if they say, you know, in terms of stepping into academia from the professional world, if they ask, you know, what are the types of research publications, or have you taught before? Like what types of kind of parameters do they like look for in terms of saying, oh, okay, this person would be a great, you know, like if someone was transitioning into the field from professional to academia, kind of what are the key indicators they look for?
So I have to say that even though I spent so long at the GSB and I won the MBA Distinguished Teaching Award, and I was a very popular and well-known teacher, I was never a professor, and I was never tenured. And I never would have been. And I knew that from the moment I arrived, because the academic credentials I would have needed in order to be on that track, I just didn't have. Not only did I not have them, I had no desire to have them. I was not a researcher. I was not into publishing or perishing. I was into teaching. So at a place like the GSB, there are really 2 categories of teachers. There are the professors, who are the tenured professors, and there are what they call the lecturers, also in some places known as adjuncts. And it's my dear colleague, Joel Peterson, who is also a lecturer and who also happens to be the chairman of JetBlue. And I used to have a running joke. We were like the immigrant farm workers. Without us, the system fell apart because the students wanted to be taught by practitioners. However, the school could not have its academic reputation be what it was without all of the scholars. You know how it's Fielding, we talk about the fact that we're scholar practitioners, which of course means that we're marginalized in both worlds. We're not scholarly enough for the academics, but we're too scholarly for the practitioners. Frankly, that never bothered me. It was like, well, that's kind of your problem. But back to your question, Lisa, I don't know that if I had shown up and said, hey, I'd like to teach here, I would have ever gotten to first base. I think there was this class that they desperately needed another teacher for. I happened to know somebody. They happened to think I was really skilled interpersonally. So I was skilled at what I would be teaching. And they gave me a shot. I don't know that that's a very satisfying answer.
I appreciate your answer. No, thank you. It sounds really helpful. Yeah.
Good. Other questions?
Hi, Carole. This is really very interesting, and everybody see some old friends and faces. And I wanted to, the more I hear you speak, the more I want to know how to use this with slightly younger people, because there's such a crisis going on right now. Say high schoolers, that age is really struggling, and
Yeah.
I could see, I could see a lot of parents going, oh, well, I'll look for a counselor. Well, they're online too. And, and the kids want to connect. And it just, there's something really magical that, because I went to Charlie's tea groups as well. And, I just wonder your opinion on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, when we launched Leaders in Tech, my new startup, it was based on a year-long fellowship program for CEO founders in Silicon Valley. And the program is based on a 4-day intensive tea group experience, and then a year-long, half a day a month of further learning. And in 2020, we were unable to launch, we launched cohort number 4 in February, and then that was it. We also had already planned 4 just standalones for in response to popular demand by the CEOs who said, I'd like you to help provide this for all the people who work for me. So we had developed a 4-day standalone program, all of which we had to cancel. In October, we experimented with an online version, which, much to my surprise, was actually quite successful. We had an NPS, I don't know if y'all know that, and a net promoter score of like 9.3 in our October program. We did it again in November, and we're going to do another one in February and another one in April. That's to say that, and by the way, where's my Chicago guy? Are you still?
Here I am,
yeah.
right here.
And by the way, Drew, here's another tip. Updating our mental models, our beliefs and assumptions about what works and what doesn't, and why it works. That would be another like major thing to put in the tip drawer.
Yeah, and let me congratulate you for wrapping your arms around that and delivering it to us, because my research was into tech leaders and what it is that they do or don't do that helps their followers make more effective decisions. And guess what the top response from the followers was?
Yeah.
Take a guess.
Connection.
Connection was a big write-in winner, but it was empowerment. It's get out of my way and let me try it.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also some interesting research about referent power as a source of power for leaders, which is if you show up as a person that other people admire, want to emulate, see as a role model, want to be more like, it's a huge source of power for leaders. And that's also related to what you're talking about. But if I come back to you, Elizabeth, one of the things that we're learning is that in virtual environments, we have to double down on stuff that we're not even that good at when we're in person. Like, let's start with talking about feelings. By the way, the reason the class is called Touchy Feely is that we have to develop a vocabulary of feelings, literally. And by the way, it's in the appendix of the book. By the book, you'll get the vocabulary of feelings. that we had to give every student, and then we had to hold them accountable to having the discipline to use the feeling words. So terms like, I feel that, followed by anything, is never a feeling. It's grammatically impossible. I feel that you don't care is not a feeling. And people think it's an I statement, but it's not. It's a you statement in disguise. I feel like it doesn't matter to you is not a feeling. So there is huge power and discipline in learning how to use feeling words, and they are connecting, much more connecting than the thoughts that are expressed with phrases like I just said. And kids especially, you know what we do to kids? We socialize expressing feelings out of them. Watch a 2 and a 4-year-old sometime. I love to tell this story. When my kids are now 31 and 33, but when they were 4 and 6, maybe 5 and 7. Anyway, they're playing. And my son, who's the 7-year-old, is, I don't know what they're playing. And my daughter says, Nick, you keep choosing the game, and I want to choose the next game. He says, okay, let's finish what we're playing. And they finish what they're playing. She says, okay, now we're going to play Candyland. He says, no. Before she says anything, he says, okay, now we're going to play dominoes. She says, no, I said I choose the next game. I don't like that you choose every game. I want to play Candyland. He says, well, I don't want to play Candyland. I want to play dominoes. She said, okay, well, when you're ready to switch back and forth, which person chooses the game, I'll be in my room. You can come get me. I don't like that I don't have a say in what we play, period. She didn't know to say, you're a bully, you don't care about me, you're lording it over me. She hadn't learned that yet. She just knew to say behavior, impact. You do this, it has this impact on me, I'll be in my room. So Nick comes running into the kitchen. Mommy, Molly won't play with me. I said, honey, I'm so sorry. That is just not what I heard. I heard that she was very clear that unless you're willing to go back and forth, that she really doesn't want to play because she doesn't like that. So now he goes, trudging off down the hall. Okay, Molly, we can play Candyland. But can we play dominoes afterward? She's like, yes. And they came back out and they played. And then they took turns. How simple. How simple. And what is it that we do to kids that makes it hard for them to keep that kind of clean way of communicating with each other? Oh, Elizabeth, your sound is off. Can't hear you. Uh-oh.
Yeah, I was thinking that we just mentalize everything.
Because we value thinking so much more than feeling, right? We reward thinking. Nobody ever got an A because they said, I feel better about the 4 answer than the 5 answer, right? So there's a whole way in which we get acclimated. And then, and in business especially, boy, we ask people to leave half of themselves in the parking lot. The most important half of themselves. I'm going to tell you another story, if you will, unless you're bored. You bored? Anybody bored?
No, keep going. This is great.
This is a good story. This is a good example story of a story I could tell my students that made me, that ended up labeling me Queen of Touchy Feely. So I'm 10 years into my career. I'm running this big business, $50 million, which in those days was a lot of money in the early 80s. And I've been promoted and I'm now running a 13 Western state region. I'm at an offsite with the guys who work for me at that point. I still hadn't convinced my management to let me hire a woman because, by the way, they didn't want a woman working for a woman working for a woman. Ooh, okay. We can always go back to that one. But anyway, I'm sitting there at this offsite with my guys. The following year, it was my guys and women. And I I got a little agitated. You know, I was trying to sell them an idea. I thought we had this opportunity to do something really cool, and they were all just kind of looking at me, crickets. And I got a little more agitated. I was like, come on, you guys, like, how cool would this be? This could be really fun. Nothing. And then I got even more agitated and frustrated. And I was like, what is wrong with you? And one of my guys leaned in like this, and he looked at me and he said, is that water in the corner of your eye? Oh my God, are you going to cry? And then he said, are you human after all? Are you human after all? And then I burst out crying. And then I said, you don't think I'm effing human? And I didn't say it that way because I was in industrial automation and I could use the real word. I don't think there's anything more important for us to talk about than that. And I tore up our agenda. We had a 2-day offsite, and we spent the next 2 days talking about who we really were and why we were there and what we were hoping to accomplish. And that's when we became a team. That's when I became a leader. And I never forgot that. And I realized that that's when I realized I was leaving half of myself in the parking lot. I am not advocating everybody needs to burst out crying at work, but I am saying that I had so overlearned the message about how I couldn't afford to be emotional, that the folks who worked for me had stopped seeing me as a human being. What is wrong with that picture?
So is that the bottom line there, Carole? That that piece of learning right there, that the over management of the display of one's emotions in the workplace essentially makes one appear untrustworthy because it prevents people from knowing who we are.
Well, it definitely doesn't create connection. And it definitely is distancing for most people. It also, I think that it's a great example of how a cat doesn't sit on a hot stove twice, but it doesn't sit on a cold stove either. So at some point, somebody has displayed emotion and it hasn't turned out to be a good time to do it. And then they've overlearned. Oh my God, I better not ever display emotion. Remember I said earlier, this concept of appropriate authenticity is an important concept. If I had burst out crying the first month that I was on the job when I was still a sales engineer because I lost an order, I'm sure I would not have become a junior executive running a $50 million region. But I had got, and that's the problem with mental models. They get set at a particular point in time, and we don't go back to re-examine whether or not they're still serving us. And we don't have anything in our lives giving us incentive to go back and re-examine them, unless we have coaches or we go through programs like Fielding when we're a little older and have an opportunity to examine our mental models and update them. What were you going to say, Hilary?
I just saw the hands. Yeah,
okay.
I just saw the hands raised, but it's fine. It was Drissat.
So I think this might be a good time to ask, really thinking about how to apply this during the pandemic. We're screens right now, when we're used to having this interpersonal relationship in feelings and touchy feely, and we can't do the touchy feely now. How could you integrate that into the world that we've been living in for the last year?
Well, I'm going to push back a little and say you can't do touchy feely the way you always have. It doesn't mean you can't. So, the book is essentially the course, Interpersonal Dynamics, aka Touchy Feely, one chapter at a time. At the end of every chapter, there's a section called Deepen Your Learning with practical suggestions for what you can go do to create more connection with the people in your life. And I would hazard to say that 3/4 of those things you can do during the pandemic, maybe more. It might look a little different. You might have to up the level of certain things that you say because you can't rely on the nonverbals to come across as strongly. But there's nothing to prevent you from reaching out, from asking people how they're doing. Let me give you an example. I have one of the CEO founders in my program went from 30 people to 130 people in 2020. Most of them have never met. And he was worried about what was that going to mean for them. So he instituted something called Talk. It's based on something else that they do at Stanford, but which essentially is any employee who wants to can volunteer to spend 20 minutes on a YouTube and do a YouTube video. And by the way, he was the first one. And they make a YouTube video that's now available to an internal channel in their company that basically answers the question, if you really knew me. If you really knew me, this is what you'd know about me. This is what I want you to know about me as a colleague. And let me tell you, most of those people have never met, and yet, wow, do they have a culture of connection already? And they've done it all during COVID. They also have just been through, they're going through he bought a book for every employee, God bless him. They're also going through a workshop where we are providing training on the feedback model that's part of Leaders in Tech and part of Touchy Feely and in the book, and then providing application and facilitating application sessions so that every person in the company knows how to give and receive feedback using the same language, using the same model. And they all are learning that there is nothing more efficient than the truth, which is what I said way back at the beginning. So, and they've done it all during COVID.
I have a question in the chat here. If we use the term touchy-feely, I would be curious if you noticed any similarities or differences between emotional risk-taking and vulnerability and physical risk-taking and vulnerability.
Yep.
Interested in any potential implications for coaching or experiential learning. Thanks, Steve, for the question.
Yeah, thank you. And it's a really good question. And in fact, the term touchy-feely is becoming more and more challenging to use by the Stanford Graduate School of Business for obvious reasons. Back when, by the way, they started calling it touchy-feely 30 years ago. And I've always said it's a lot more about it's called touchy-feely because it's about feelings. So it's a lot more about the feely than the touchy. It's never been about touchy. And it now has more and more implications that make people uncomfortable. And I think it's important to acknowledge those. It's important to speak to those. It's important to create an environment where somebody can say, you know, that term makes me feel uncomfortable. And then we can talk about it. You know, for years, there's also been the soft skills versus the hard skills. And of course, the soft skills are the hardest skills to learn. So there's a lot about language that gets complicated. It's a great question. I think the GSB has got a really interesting challenge right now because when you have 40 years of alums who are attached, it's a brand. It's a brand, and it now means something that it was never intended to mean to some people, which we have to be really sensitive to.
Thank you.
And I have another question in here. So does this apply in multicultural contexts?
That's another really great question. So 40% of the students at the GSB are international. And actually, we have an even higher representation of international students in Touchy Feely, probably closer to 50%. By the way, because it's so oversubscribed, students have to do something called super round it. They have to put it at the top of the list of the electives courses they want to take. Otherwise, you don't get into it. So there's a lot of students who wanted to take it who never take it, which is one of the reasons we wrote the book. We wrote the book, and I want to come back to why we wrote the book in a moment, but let me finish answering this question. There's no question that the concepts require adaptation to different cultures. So, for example, providing feedback, in a direct way, can feel very shaming in certain cultures. And so being sensitive to that and making sure that your intent in providing this feedback is because you're invested in that person and you want them to be better. And by the way, you don't do it in public. If you're in Latin America or in an Asian, organization, you do it privately, and you do it. We're back to 15%. You do a little bit and you see how it goes. So we're back to one size doesn't fit all. And there's no question that one has to be culturally sensitive in using all this. And I also think that what I discovered and learned from my international students, particularly my Asian and Latin students, was, yeah, you know what? The problem is that everybody then doesn't tell us the truth. They pull punches because they're afraid. They're afraid to offend us. So then we actually end up missing out. And we feel marginalized. It's like, what, you don't think I can take it? So you got to be careful you're not using it as an excuse because it feels uncomfortable to give somebody, challenging feedback. Did that answer the question somewhat for whoever asked it? Yeah, okay. Let me get back to why we wrote the book. Because, by the way, class has been around a long time. Why is the book only now coming out, you might ask? Maybe you didn't, but that was the question that we kept being asked for decades. Why isn't there a book? Why isn't there a book? Why isn't there a book? Well, for starters, David and I wanted to make sure that when we wrote a book, we could write a book that we thought would would have the same kind of potential impact that the course had had. And it took us a while to figure out how to do that. But it wouldn't have gotten started in the first place if we hadn't had our editor from Penguin. We had an editor from Penguin Random House who came to us and said, "Come on, you guys, write a book." And we gave him the same answer we'd given lots of people that had approached us. No, we're not writing a book, or at least not yet. And he said, so let's see. There's this course that thousands of alumni for decades have said has absolutely changed their life and continues to change their life. And you're okay with the only people having that and having that knowledge and building that capacity, being the people who are lucky enough and privileged enough to get into the Stanford Graduate School of Business or into Carole's fancy executive programs? How is that okay with you? Well, then he had us. Now it's 4 years later. It took us 4 years to write this book. By the way, it was like being pregnant for 3.5 years and then being in labor for 6 months. For those of you who've written books, you might recognize that. And I don't know about the rest of you, but now that I've got the book, it's like I'm a single mother because I'm looking for my village to help me raise it because the publishers, especially the US publisher, which is not the one that approached us, is quite disappointing.
I have a question here in the chat, Carole, from Christy. Where do you see the line between appropriate and inappropriate authenticity, especially when it comes to feelings?
Well, I'm really sorry if you're expecting an answer. Oh, the line is at 30%. These feelings are okay. These feelings are not okay. It's just never going to be that simple. It depends on the relationship in the first place. It depends on, it is important and useful to know that some feelings are connecting and some feelings are distancing. Anger tends to be a more distancing feeling initially. If you've read any of Ekman's work, if you've read, you know, he does a really great job of describing the impact of different feelings. If you ever saw, what was that wonderful Disney movie about feelings, Inside Out? If you didn't see Inside Out, go rent Inside Out and watch it. It's wonderful, not to mention lots of fun. But we're back to 15% rule. Some feelings are, in fact, the vocabulary of feelings that I told you about earlier has a low intensity, mild intensity, high intensity categories of feelings. You know, and we're back to the antenna. Appropriate authenticity is what feels right to you in this moment with this person in this situation. You know, I'll give you an example of something that I used to, of appropriate authenticity. I'm a VP of marketing, and we've just had our third disastrous quarter in a row. We've lost market share 3 quarters in a row. Now I can stand in front of the troops and say, that's the 3rd quarter in a row we've lost market share, and I have no idea what we're going to do about it. We are hosed, and I'm not sure I should even be your VP of marketing. Well, that would be authentic. And I feel really insecure. That would be very authentic and probably inappropriate. I could also stand in front of the troops and say, you know, that's the 3rd quarter in a row we've lost market share. It's hard for me to admit that, to stand here in front of all of you and admit that, and yet not admitting it doesn't feel right. I have some ideas about what we might do, but I really need you. And I think together we've got a much better shot at figuring out what we're going to do to get out of this. And I'm really grateful that you're all with me. Different message. Different set of feelings. One inappropriate, one more appropriate. Is that helpful?
That's super helpful. Thanks. It's especially like the connecting and the distancing feelings, considering those things, I think is really helpful.
Now, you know, what's really interesting, Christy, is that feelings like hurt and sadness and happiness are the most connecting feelings, but they also make us feel the most vulnerable. And those are correlated. There's a reason for that.
Can I jump in on that for a second, Carole, with a question?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So those feelings, but what I've seen oftentimes in doing or trying to do leadership development is that a lot of stuff goes unsaid.
Yes.
And managers or leaders at different levels walk around with a whole huge backpack of anger and fear around what they should or shouldn't or wish or wouldn't say to somebody else.
Yep.
And the fear gets in the way of taking that first step.
Yes.
What have you seen to be a successful path to encourage people to be willing to start taking small risks?
Well, first of all, you do have to start small. Second of all, fear. I used to have a partner in one of my consulting in one of my consulting businesses who used to say fear is sometimes an acronym for false expectations appearing real.
Or false evidence appearing real.
And so you have to start by testing a little bit. Mm-hmm. I also think that naming your fear is not a bad way to go. You know, I want to tell you something. And I want to tell you because I really think we'd both be better off if I was if I told you this. I think our relationship would be better off. I think it would be useful for you to know it. And I'm afraid. I'm afraid to tell you because, and then I can say a little bit about it. And by the way, you're absolutely right that most people walk around, you know, Adrian Rich in a wonderful poem said that which remains unspoken becomes unspeakable. And so this is something else we talk about in the book. There's a concept of pinches. Somebody does something that's mildly annoying. We don't say anything. So what do? They keep doing it. And then we get more annoyed. And then after a while, the pinch becomes a crunch. Wouldn't it have been easier to address way back when it was a little pinch? But you got to create cultures that embrace that. And you've got to have leaders that model that. And you've got to learn how to repair, which is also a really important element of the course and the book, which is we all make mistakes. We all step in a pile of doo-doo at one point or another. But it's not until we have and we've repaired, we've come back, that we learn how to repair. And then that gives us a little more confidence that if we make a mistake, we'll be able to repair, and then we can take more risks. So in fact, the last chapter of the book is a true story of David Bradford and me and how our relationship went to absolute hell in a handbasket, how I said I would never talk to him again, and how we came back from it. And how we came back from it using everything that we always taught and talk about. So, you know, we all screw up and we all have lots to learn about how to repair, no matter how often we've done it.
Yeah, I really appreciate the idea about the fear that false expectations appearing real, because I feel it kind of really underlines the imposter phenomena and
Yep.
a lot of what individuals may feel coming into a workplace where they already might feel othered. So for example, if a female doesn't want to show emotions because she already believes if she's deemed over emotional, she won't be deemed as competent.
Right.
So my question was thinking about how cultural fit is highly regarded in organizations, and how can we create a culture of inclusion where diverse individuals can contribute their competencies and their skills and feel comfortable bringing their full selves without being othered, without that fear of having to overcome they're perceived as a particular way and moving forward.
Well, frankly, if more people knew how to do that, the world would be a much better place, wouldn't it? And it starts with making it okay for people to speak their truth, and to make it okay. I mean, within reason. I can think of certain truths that, you know, for some very small segment of the population that we could all easily do without. But in general, people don't know how to show up in a way that builds connection. Bottom line, they don't know, and they especially don't know how to connect across differences. And you know, we used to argue sometimes at the GSB that the course should have been called Connecting Across Differences, because it's easy to connect with people that are just like you. And it's easy to connect with people that think just like you and that have had a life experience that's like yours. But the fact is, you know, we're not going to succeed never mind in business, in life, unless we learn how to connect across differences. And frankly, that's the other reason that we're so committed to getting the book out into the world, which is, I honestly, with every fiber of my being, believe, I don't really care about making money. I believe with every fiber of my being that if we had a critical mass of people let's forget the world, in this country, who had the capacity and the competence and the skill that we're talking about, we would have different families, different organizations, different communities, and maybe, God forbid, different government. Do you know that in the old days, there used to be one cafeteria in Congress? And that in recent years, there's now the Democrat cafeteria and the Republican cafeteria, because they can't even have a meal in the same cafeteria. You wonder how things got to where they are. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I've got 2 minutes left. So I think I'm going to ask ask you whether or not there's anything else you want to say, Hilary, or how you want to wrap up.
Oh goodness, and I feel like this could just go on. And Kay had left a message saying, I think we need a whole nother workshop with Carole. This has just been fantastic. You know, personally, professionally, there's just so much to take from this. And I just, my goodness, I enjoy being a part of sessions like this. And Carole, it's been such a pleasure to get to know you and take your time. Carole's on tour with her book. I put a link in the chat here so you can take a check it out. But this content is so important. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Thank you.
And we have to leave a little bit early because she has a very important phone call. So we're gonna have to cut out a little bit early. But for those who want to watch this again, this is recorded. It's available on the Attendee Hub on the website. It'll take about an hour or so to load up. Feel free to put some last comments in chat here. We have about 2 minutes left. Do you have some last words, Carole, that you'd like to share before we sign off?
You know, I'll say one other thing. And you know, some people say you can take the girl out of sales, but you can never take the sales out of the girl. Consider buying a book for yourself and a book for somebody important in your life. Everybody's like, oh, okay, I'm going to buy a book. You know, you're more likely to actually use it and do something with it if you read it with somebody else. And honestly, I care less about, that's my alarm telling me it's time for my next call. I care a whole lot less about, if I could give you one, if you bought one, I would. For me, it's more important that you use it and that you do something with it. Something great, which I know Fielding folks do.
Can we all put our hands up like that? Touchy feely, touchy feely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really been fun and a pleasure.
Thank you so much,
I
Carole.
know you go forth and do great things.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, and you know what? One last thing. There is you'll put up the website for the book, because if you work with organizations and you want to do any kind of, you want to give somebody a bulk buy link, there's good discounts for bulk buys and like that. So just give them the website too.
Sure, I'll do that on the event page. So just go back there. Okay, bye everyone. Take care. Have a great
Thank you,
evening.
everybody.